I want to start this video off by apologizing. Apologizing because you've just been clickbaited.
And for my next trick, I will make your life disappear.
Because the truth is, Marik isn't the worst villain. He's actually one of the best villains in Yu-Gi-Oh! However, I believe the majority of Yu-Gi-Oh! Fans will disagree, and I don't think they're 100% to blame. Marik as a villain just doesn't receive his credit due to the damage the Yu-Gi-Oh! Dub did to his character story. How do I know this? Well, unfortunately, I was one of those fools.
No! It can't be!
I also believed Marik to be a terrible villain growing up, but when I started reading the manga and watching the subbed version of the anime, it kinda just opened up an entirely different perspective on the character, which I will be sharing with you today. But before I do, make sure you like and subscribe, or else. Marik is a well-developed villain with motives and goals which accurately represent the trauma he experienced as a child. Well, it did in the manga anyway. However, as things are adapted into the 4Kids version of the anime, some things are chosen to be left out as they can be inappropriate for children-based audiences, as we saw from the absence of any guns in the anime, just in case the kids saw it and turned into someone like this. I can understand that some cutbacks had to be made for the anime to blossom. However, where I think they should never cut back on is the development of the main villain of the story. A great villain, in my opinion, can single-handedly save a story more than a great protagonist could ever do, as villains are naturally more relatable. As we humans are all secretly villains pretending to be good people.
Are you talking to me?
I think the most impactful kind of villain is a broken character, as it allows the audience to develop a complicated relationship with the character, leading us to confront our own inner feelings towards them. This also helps develop the character away from being a boring, one-dimensional maniac who is only interested in world domination, which I think the Yu-Gi-Oh! Dub is guilty of when it comes to the honest portrayal of the character Marik. Marik's backstory is one of tragedy, and once we dive into how deep and heart-wrenching it actually is, we can empathize and even understand the complex emotions which leads Marik to becoming the villain he did. For those who have seen Avengers Infinity War will understand that Thanos as a villain was in a similar boat to Marik. At first, Thanos seemed like a megalomaniac which wanted to basically commit mass genocide. However, once we understood the motivations behind his aims, which was his own planet Titan falling due to overpopulation and eventually running out of resources, it struck a chord with the audience. That Thanos didn't want any other civilizations to fall like his own home planet did. And suddenly, Thanos in my books wasn't the crazy psychopath everyone made him out to be. Or maybe that was just me. Now, I'm not saying Marik's actions were morally correct by any means, but were his actions justifiable and understandable when we learn about his inner turmoil and struggles he had to endure as a kid? Well, if you were an anime dub watcher, you probably wouldn't think so, as his backstory was glossed over and Marik as a whole wasn't given much depth. The manga, however, displayed a lot of inner conflict which personally made Marik a more interesting character. Now let's do a little dive into Marik's backstory in the viewpoint of a manga reader or a subbed Yu-Gi-Oh! Watcher, and we can compare and contrast what information the dub gives you compared to what information the original source material gives you. Marik's backstory is told in two parts. One is via Marik's adopted brother Odeon, and the second is via his sister Ishizu. Now we learn early on that Marik's birth itself was very complicated, as Marik was a part of the Tombkeeper family, and they were burdened with keeping the pharaoh secret and passing it on from generation to generation by inscribing the details on the back of the firstborn son of the family, which happened to be Marik. Now, before Marik was born, his parents were worried about not being able to give birth to a baby boy, therefore deciding to use Odeon as a fill-in for Marik essentially. Good old reliable Odeon.
Of course! Mother, does this mean I'll be exactly like you and father?
However, lucky for Marik's father, eventually they managed to give birth to Marik, and unlucky for Marik's mum, she passed away giving birth to him. Now both the dub and subbed did justice with this scene, as both implied that she'd passed away with her final words to Odeon. With the manga literally only using one speech bubble to explain the situation. Now this, I believe, is a pretty big deal, and I think Yugioh as a whole failed on exploring the guilt and trauma on Marik when he realizes this later on. I mean, just look at Gaara from Naruto. They dive into his mother trauma a lot, maybe even too much, but it all comes together to represent how they turn out in the future. Now moving on from this, Marik was always coddled and protected by his father as a child, with Odion receiving the harsh punishments in his stead. This is another important factor to understand. Marik was in a position where he felt constantly guilty, as he was the reason his older brother would get beaten. Violence in Yugioh? The truth is, Odion was constantly beaten by Marik's father, something that the dub decided to, cut out. For example, in the subbed version, you can literally hear the Dragon Ball Z punch sound effects, which had been taken out of the dub. But this was important to highlight two things. One is that Marik's father was super strict and abusive, and two, even when Marik was being protected by his father, he had to experience the mental torture of seeing his older brother take the beatings in his place. Odion, holding years of resentment towards Marik, understandably, can I just add, pulls a knife on him, attempting to kill Marik. However, Marik, with his childlike innocence, shows that he understands the pain Odion is going through and apologizes, and reveals to Odion that he had always seen him as his older brother, which moved Odion to tears, as being accepted into the family had always been a dream of his. Now, I can't hate on the dubbed version for removing the knife, but the consequences of that is, it takes away the high stakes of that scene, and it doesn't hit you as deeply, as Odion's adopted mother's last words to Odion was to protect Marik, which was something he was almost going to go against by murdering him. But overall, the dub does still capture how close Marik and Odion's bond were, which is the most important factor in this scene.
I'll never let you down again, Master Marik. Please forgive me. I promise to always protect you.
Years pass by, and it's almost time for Marik to have the Tomb Keeper's ritual. However, Marik was afraid. Growing up, I didn't realize what the big deal was, and until I read the manga and watched the subbed version of the anime, I understood. The ritual was brutal, and Marik had every right to be terrified at the age of 10 years old. Marik in both the subbed and the dubbed version is seen begging to Odion to help him. However, this is where the dubbed version stops and the subbed version continues. The Tomb Keeper ritual is a process where the Pharaoh's secrets are carved into your back with a sterilized knife. However, Marik was awake throughout the entire process without any sort of pain relief you might find in today's hospitals. Now, due to the horrific nature of the ceremony, we, for obvious reasons, don't get to see the exact nature of it. However, we see the shadows and the screams, which paint us a good enough image. There's a really powerful scene in the subbed version where we see a candle being lit, and throughout the procedure we see the candle being burnt down until it's just a puddle of wax. This is to represent how long the ceremony was, and if anyone knows how long it takes a candle to reach the bottom, that's a good 5 or 6 hours of torture. Yet again, I can't blame the dubbed version for taking this out. Most of the details could give a child nightmares. However, I think skipping the entire scene completely was a giant mistake. The Tomb Keeper's ritual was the root cause where this innocent child, begging Odion to save him, ended up following the path of evil. Now, Marik formed an evil personality which was born from that night, feeding on the fear and the pain he had to endure during the ritual. This is key to Marik's story arc, so I believe the dub could have added something along the lines of the screams we could hear from Marik, or even the candle, just to show how long the procedure was, to give some light on Marik's suffering. Now, immediately after the ceremony, Marik asks a question which shows how far he had come from that sweet, innocent child. He asks Odion who he should hate for this, desperately trying to find someone to blame for his pain and suffering. However, after Odion revealed his own self-inflicted scars to Marik, it helped Marik contain the evil inside of him, just temporarily. Now, this is all the information we get from Odion. The second part we receive is from Ishizu on the Battle City blimp, recanting their childhood in Egypt to Yugi and his friends. However, when we move to the next panel in the manga, we get a graphic image of Marik's back after the ritual, which we aren't privy to see in the anime due to the significant amount of blood shown. Now, just to be clear, it took Marik over 5 days where he was passed out in order to recover from the pain. Now, Marik, who had never left his home for all those 10 years, planned to go out with his sister Shizu, secretly going behind the rules of the Tomb Keepers. This scene is done perfectly in both the dub and the sub, as we can physically see the seeds of freedom and desire grow inside of Marik, as he is fascinated by the outside world, especially by the motorbike. This is also when they run into Shadi, an ancient spirit. However, this is where the dub can be a little misleading. In the dub, Shadi gives the Ishtar family a warning of the pharaoh's arrival, which seems like an innocent gesture.
Pharaoh will soon return to this world. Prepare for him.
Hey, wait! Who are you anyway?
Ready yourselves right now. Your lives and your destinies depend on it.
However, in the subbed version, it's completely different. Shadi tells Shizu and Marik of the bloodshed that is to follow, and that is due to the pharaoh's will.
墓守の者よ、これからそなたらを導く運命。その惨劇はすべてファラオの意志なり、ファラオの魂を探すのだ。
Pretty much blaming the pharaoh for what is to come, telling Marik to go search for the pharaoh. You see, Shadi knew the pharaoh had to come in contact with Marik in order to fulfill his destiny, and he was determined to unite them together, even if it meant sending Marik down the wrong path and searching for the pharaoh for the wrong reasons. Now, when the story continues, they head back to their home. However, they discover that an alarm had been set, which had alerted Marik's father of their secret plan. As usual, Odeon took the beating for Marik's disobedience and was severely whipped and injured due to this. However, in the dub, Ishizu states that Odeon had been weakened by the Millennium Rod in an obvious attempt to hide the blood and the violence which comes with a physical whip. Now, I don't really have an issue with this as the result was the same. Marik, seeing his older brother in pain and close to death, for the first time gave in to his evil side, and Yami Marik was officially born, using the Millennium Rod to paralyze and then murder his own father. Again, in the dub, it was changed to sending his father to the Shadow Realm. Odeon managed to bring back the good Marik, as they have a close bond we talked about earlier. However, the interesting part is that when he comes back to his senses, he looks at his father's body and has no idea what had happened to him, completely oblivious that he was responsible for his father's death. Marik's mind had completely shattered into two different personalities. However, it was in this moment Shadi entered the scene and told Marik that the pharaoh was responsible for his father's death, and once again twisting the narrative in Marik's head in order for Marik to search for the pharaoh. Shadi had answered the question Marik had asked early on in the manga. Who should he hate for this? Well, the answer was now given to him. His fate, his father's death, the miserable life he had endured up until this moment was due to the pharaoh. Now, doesn't this make so much more sense at why Marik went recklessly in pursuit of the pharaoh's power? Because for me, it personally never made much sense. Now, if you watch the scene in the dubbed version, Shadi gives Marik another warning. Now, this is a grave injustice to Marik's character, because it doesn't tie Marik's fate with the pharaoh's, like it did in the subbed or the manga, which leaves Marik's obsession on attaining revenge and stealing the pharaoh's power a hollow goal with no real substance. Now, in conclusion, I think due to the alterations made from Marik's backstory, the dub was forced to make Marik into a classic bad guy, which is just a real shame, because he is probably one of the most complex and interesting characters in Yu-Gi-Oh! I think the dub could have done a lot more. However, I think their main focus was to remove the non-kid friendly content, whilst also trying to create a cohesive story which still works. And because of this, they didn't put much thought into how this hurts the character in the long run. Let me know if this video shed a different light to Marik as a villain, or was he always your favourite villain to begin with? Thanks for watching guys, until next time.